Alright, so this is the first of the lectures that we're going to go through that cover the different ecosystems of the marine environment. And we're first going to talk about the intertidal zone. This is a place that many people enjoy going to. It's where you kind of hang out at the beach. This is me and my family at a beach along the Oregon coast. One of the things I really love to do with them is when the tide goes out, you can go and look at all these tide pools and look at all the different organisms which live there, and kind of see them clinging to life and the many challenges in the intertidal zone. Alright, so what we're going to go over, first we'll define the intertidal zone, which is this area between the low and high tide. And then we're going to talk about when the intertidal zone is exposed, where the organisms live within the intertidal zone, the challenges of the intertidal environment, and the resources and adaptations of the organisms that live there. Now, the next zone down would be the subtidal zone, which is always immersed in water. But the intertidal zone is the area which, at least for part of the tide cycle, is exposed to the air. So the type of substrate really defines a lot of the organisms that are living within the intertidal zone. And the substrate is the bottom, right? The sand or rock or geology, which is lying beneath the ocean water at the sea floor. The intertidal zone in the west coast, on those active margins, is generally rocky, has a steep slope. And on the east coast, which we're going to go to, is more soft bottom intertidal zone, which has a combination of sand, silt, or mud, depending on the inputs it is next to. And so this, of course, is going to have a great effect on the organisms that live there. If there's rocky, hard substances which are in place, a lot of the organisms are going to cling to that area. If you have a soft bottom substrate, then you're going to have things burrowing into it instead. So in the organisms that live in the intertidal zone, we can split them into different levels. The epifauna live on the surface, so some examples might be snails, barnacles, and mussels would be on hard substrates. The infauna, which live in the substrate, such as clams that burrow into the soft bottom. And then the meiofauna, which are the organisms that are so small that they live in between the cracks and spaces of the particles of sand or whatever substrate is there. And these organisms can move, or they can be fixed in place, so they can be motile or sessile. So in a soft bottom intertidal zone, like I said, the substrate really affects what kind of organisms can live there. Gravel is going to be basically small rocks, and there's a lot of space that can provide many habitat for many different types of organisms. Sand is large particles, but not as big as gravel. Silt then is even smaller than sand, and clay are a very, very, very small substrate, where the water clings to the clay and doesn't allow a lot of oxygen, doesn't allow a lot of air or any other type of organism to survive. So clay generally is not very conducive to a lot of life. Gravel and sand and even some silt provides a little more availability of resources. Alright, so here are in a soft bottom intertidal zone are some of the ways that organisms might live within a substrate. Either burrowed within it, or maybe even staying within the water itself and partially being submerged, such as sand dollars. And then you'll have other plants, algae, and organisms which will live along the edges, the margins as well. So some of the challenges of the intertidal zone include water loss due to the tide and the evaporation, which is going to occur there. You're also going to have very drastic temperature changes as the water goes out. The water itself will be relatively stable in its temperature, whereas being exposed to air is going to expose you to a lot more air and sunlight. Is going to expose you to drastic temperature changes. Salinity is going to change. You may have interrupted feeding schedules if you rely on the water. The wave action and the tides may cause physical damage to your organisms. So organisms are going to be built then to handle all these different challenges. So desiccation. So to prevent drying out, some of the things they do are hide. So they find cool areas where they can conserve their water, or they might clam up, close off their shells, or these chitons actually form a little suction cup, so they are sealed against the rock. And some of the problems with clamming, though, is that it makes it so that you are unable to do anything else. You just have to wait until the water comes back out before you can move, before you can eat or anything else. Temperature, a few different things that you can do. You can radiate heat away from your body, such as some snails do this with ridges on their shells. It helps radiate heat away. You might hide in cool places like the chitons we saw before in a depression. You may be able to tolerate temperature. So periwinkles, which are types of snails, they can survive up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very high for an organism. Or you may have specific coloration, such as white shells, which will reflect the sunlight. All right, salinity. If you remember, the salinity of the ocean water is 25 parts per thousand. If you are in an estuary or near a river, it varies between 5 and 30 parts per thousand. Salinity in this area is going to change, right, with evaporation. Organisms are going to have mechanisms in place to be able to tolerate a wide range. A euryhaline organism, then, is one that can, without any modification, just tolerate a wide variety of salinities. And so, we'll show another graph later. Another problem is interrupted feeding. So most organisms are going to rely on the water to feed, either through filter feeding. But predators, on the other hand, can probably feed most of the time. Algae eaters are going to scrape kind of the bottom where the algae is growing. And so the ideal time to eat is going to depend on what type of feeder you are. If you're a carnivore, you're probably going to do better when other things are feeding and they are open and more susceptible to whatever you do. Sea stars, however, are able to pry open some of these bivalves which clam up. But let's say if you're a crab or a scavenger, you're probably going to wait till the tide goes out and you can see all the different dead things and scavenge on that. All right, wave action, of course, is a problem. The waves are constantly crashing on the shore, especially in rocky shorelines. So you can see this actually, the difference in organisms in east and west coast in anemones, which are similar species. In the west coast, they'll be short and fat, so they can withstand more wave action, whereas in the east coast, they'll be long and skinny because the wave action isn't as much of a problem. So the organisms can tolerate also by being flexible, by reducing drag, by forming communities. So these mussels will sometimes form communities, and as a large group, you can prevent turbulence, and just by holding on. So you have these little threads which come off these mussels called abyssal threads, which will tie on to the rocky substrate as well. Space also is a problem, and in competition for space is common among intertidal organisms. So sessile organisms will attach to the substrate. Open spaces will often get colonized very quickly. Dispersal, also being able to go into the water and find new substrate. Resource partitioning, which we talked about before, and ecology is important for specifying different areas and specializing in that area so you can outcompete others. And some of the zones which are going to be most competitive are the ones most submerged by water. The most access to nutrients is going to be most competitive. But the least competitive are going to be those ones which have the most extreme parts of the environment. So the higher tides are going to be least competitive and more specialized. So disturbance also creates and allows for diversity in the intertidal zone. And sea stars, which are a top predator, act as a disturbance. They will eat mussels or clams or organisms and open up that area for other things to colonize. If you remove sea stars from an area, what happens is the most competitive species will dominate, and usually that is mussels. Okay? So disturbance, wave action, and these predators help to diversify the intertidal zone. Alright, so for soft bottom food webs, at the bottom you have plankton and diatoms. A lot of these organisms will feed off of detritus or dead and decaying matter. And you may also have chemoautotrophs, but mostly you're going to have photoautotrophs, which are going through photosynthesis. Okay, and then this here is a soft bottom food web. Not very complex. However, a intertidal food web is a little more complex. You've got a few more primary producers, seaweeds, diatoms, and seagrasses. Lots of detritus for things to eat on. They also might feed on these algae and seaweeds. And then you have this top predator, the sea star, which is able to feed on different things and free up substrate for diversity of different organisms. Alright, so that's the intertidal zone. And now we're going to talk about estuaries, which is where rivers empty into the sea. Now, there are 4 different types of estuaries. You can have drowned river valleys, which is where we're going to in the Chesapeake Bay. Used to be a landlocked or a land river, maybe a little river flowing through here in a valley. But with the last the glacial retreat, where glaciers melted, it filled in with ocean water. You can have a bar-built estuary where you have an accumulation of sediments which eventually built up. You can have a tectonic estuary where the earth has sunk due to plate tectonics. You can have fjords where basically a glacier carved an area within between substrate to form an estuary into the ocean. Alright, so some problems with estuaries are salinity, right? Changing salinity, the substrate and substrate type, temperature, and the water clarity, because you have increased sedimentation. So the salinity can vary from 5 to 30 parts per thousand as you get closer and closer out to the ocean. And it varies according to how much water is being dumped into the ocean, so the season, whether it's a dry or wet season, storms, depth. So that also, it isn't uniform from top to bottom, it also varies through depth. So some solutions to that, again, being Urey-Hallein or tolerating a wide range of salinities. You can regulate your internal salinity. You can conform and just be able to tolerate wide range. Or you may concentrate those salts within other tissues, such as occurs with pickleweed or glassworts. Alright, so here are some examples. Astenohalline, which means you can tolerate very narrow range of salinities. If that's what you are, then you're going to stay further out in the ocean where it's going to be all 35 parts per thousand. Urey-Hallein, again, tolerates a wide range, so you can find them in many different areas of the estuary. Brackish water species are going to stay where the fresh and salt water is mixing. And freshwater species generally can just barely dip into these saltwater areas, but mostly have to stay in the fresh water. So we have different types. The polychaete worm is a osmoconformer. It doesn't care what the salt water is like. The crab does a little bit of both. It's an osmoconformer at very high salinities and an osmoregulator at lower salinities. Alright, so then you have the freshwater eel and the Chinook salmon, which go from one to the other. When it does that, it has to regulate its salinities to a constant salinity within it. Alright, the substrate for these estuaries is generally sand or mud. The challenges for sand are that it's going to be constantly shifting. With mud, it's going to be compact, right? And if you have particles that are really, really small, there's not going to be a lot of oxygen going in there, so it'll be anoxic. So some solutions to that might be burrowing holes into that area so that you have oxygen and you have water flow through them. And also, most of these organisms are motile, right? They aren't stuck in one area, because if they were stuck, then they would be buried in the sediment eventually. Temperature, just like the intertidal zone, is going to frequently change, and so some of the same tactics for handling temperature in the intertidal zone are also used in the estuaries. Water clarity is going to be very low because of this input of sediments from the rivers, and this is going to reduce photosynthesis by primary producers in the water. So some solutions to that are some grasses have actually where they can tolerate these salt water estuaries, but they will do their photosynthesis out of the water. Okay, so that helps them. You also have mangroves. Again, their roots go into the estuaries, but outside, their photosynthesis is occurring in the air. So some of the communities of estuaries include open waters and bays and tidal creeks, salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrass beds and oyster reefs. So we'll talk about these. So first, open waters and bays and tidal creeks. Most fish actually spend some of their lifetime, usually the egg and larval stage, within an estuary because it offers some sort of protection from predators until they get larger and then can move out into the open ocean. So in these open water and bays and tidal creeks, you have lots of plankton, floating algae, and lots of fish and larval forms of marine organisms. Saltmarsh is the vegetated area of an estuary, so you can see all this here, a pretty marshy, kind of swampy area. Spartina species is the species of saltmarsh grass, which grows abundantly in this area. Juncus or needle rush can also be found near water in very low salinity estuaries. And you can also see that some of this pickleweed, which actually isn't in the water but very close to it. Mangroves or mangals, they're also called, are tropical and subtropical, and these have this is a very productive ecosystem because of the structure formed by these roots of these trees, which provide a substrate for lots of different marine organisms to live on, to hide from predators, and provides access to nutrients and water clarity as well. Generally in a food web system, the primary producers are, it depends on what type you have. You may have plants up in these salt marsh areas. Open water, you're going to have phytoplankton, diatoms and seaweeds, and in mangroves you're going to have these trees. And then from there you'll have different types of primary consumers and secondary consumers and carnivores. Other communities, so seagrass beds, these are found where water is very clear, so not very many areas of the world. These are actually a plant species which grows there, and you have manatees and dugongs which feed on these grass species. Oyster reefs, these act kind of like rocky intertidal zones, but rather than having the rock as the substrate, the actual oysters act as the substrate, and other organisms then can establish small ecosystems around them. The oysters also increase the clarity of the water because they are filter feeders, so they get a lot of the sediment out of the water. Alright, and that's it for our intertidal zone and estuaries.